very much for having me here and Brian. It's a real honour to be here to speak about this topic. My background, for those of you who don't know me, is I did a lot of advocacy work for people, torture survivors, and I've been active in trying to call for accountability for those who were involved in torturing prisoners in the War on Terror. So I'll speak briefly about the background to Australia's involvement and just touch on a few things. I'm conscious that you probably have questions, and I would really like to make sure this is interactive as well at the end. So please, if there's anything you want to ask, note it down for the end so that we can have more of a conversation about things that you want to know more about. And then Brian's going to give a brief talk about the backfire model, which is part of what I used in my PhD research. So that doorstop on the table is my PhD, which looked at, it's a great doorstop, but yeah, you wouldn't want it to fall on you. But I used Brian's backfire model to look at the way that torture was basically excused in the Australian context. So yeah, so there's a lot to talk about. So and I'm just very conscious of the time. So Brian's handing out two handouts for you. One is additional information about the backfire model and Brian's the 5 methods of inhibiting outrage at injustice. And the second one is a table from my thesis, which looks at the way that the methods that authorities basically go through that complement Brian's model, the way that they use different things like political rhetoric or torture as a political tool. So if you read through that and there's something that you'd like to know more about, I'm really happy to talk about it as well. So behind all of these stories, of course, are people. And it's really, really important that when we talk about this, we honour and remember that these are human beings who have been tortured and sometimes who have lost their lives. And I want to start with a personal story about an Iranian man named Tariq Al Fadhli. In 2003, Tariq was detained by Australian SAS forces in Iraq. His thumbs were bound and a Hessian sack was placed over his head. Tariq was loaded onto a UK helicopter where he was forced to the floor and knelt on. He was also reportedly punched and kicked. Tariq was being flown to a secret US black site called H1, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. However, he would never arrive to H1. He was murdered whilst being held by Australian, UK and US forces. Tariq's story exemplifies how authorities get away with torture, how they cover it up, and inevitably how they remain unaccountable. Before the death was made public, Iranian authorities contacted Australian officials to inquire about the whereabouts of their citizen, considering that Australian SAS forces had detained him. The Australian government denied being the detaining authority because a member of the US military was present. So how did they do this when it was the Australian forces who had detained him? The Australian and US government had created an agreement which meant that the presence of only one embedded member of the US military would mean that they are the detaining authority, and therefore Australia could say we had no responsibility. This is one of the first tactics used to negate responsibility. Official channels, which Brian is going to speak about, was also used to stifle public outrage. An independent and thorough investigation was denied, and instead an autopsy was carried out by UK officials. The final report was so incompetent and obfuscating that it deliberately misstated some of the most basic facts, including where the body was buried and his name. Another tactic used was to use the political and military enmeshment to create reliance. These authorities create a culture of "I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine," and ensure a culture of secrecy and protection for those who commit crimes against humanity. This enmeshment between the US, UK and Australian government led to cover-up in the case of Tariq. FOI documents, Freedom of Information documents, that were disclosed after the death show that the then Chief of the Australian Defence Force, Peter Cosgrove, authorised a minute to the Minister for Defence, Robert Hill, noting that, and I quote, "Any public disclosure of the death may be damaging to the US and UK governments." So the Australian government covered it up, all at the request of a minute authorised by Cosgrove. Cover-up and blatantly lying to the public in order to protect themselves or the US or the UK government did not only occur in relation to the death of Tariq, but also in relation to the black site he was being transferred to. A series of FOI documents demonstrate that the Australian government knew that Australian forces were being involved in atrocities and that prisoners were being handed over to black sites and other forces known to engage in torture. Yet they lied to the public, stating that they were not involved and not the detaining authority. The H1 black site in Iraq that Tariq was being transported to was a jointly controlled facility run by the CIA and JSOC. For those of you who don't know, JSOC is the Joint Special Operations Command, which has been labelled as Murder Incorporated and has operated as a paramilitary arm of the US president by basically torturing and assassinating people across the world. So this facility in Iraq was not only operated under the guise of CIA and JSOC. What is not well known is that Australian Task Force 20, a specialised SAS unit, and Task Force 14, which is a UK unit, played an integral role in the daily operations at the base. Serious human rights abuses have been documented at H1, including prisoners being bruised from head to foot due to severe beatings, prisoners who were put in stress positions. People have been found with electrical burns all over their bodies, waterboarding, rape with sticks and other implements. There is a case of a 73-year-old woman who was kept in a small room without food and water and forced to crawl around on all fours whilst a large man rode her and called her an animal. Reports indicate that there were posters on the wall that read "No blood, no foul," intimating that if the detaining personnel didn't make the prisoners bleed, there would be no accountability and no evidence of torture. Despite military involvement by some Australian military personnel, there has never been any accountability in this site, nor any others that operate as a result of the war on terror. And those within the Australian military that knew about it and voiced their opposition about what was occurring were ignored. Ample evidence has revealed that some Australian forces have handed over prisoners to military forces and private military and security contractors known to have engaged in torture, as well as evidence that some SAS forces have been involved in beating prisoners, leaving them blind, causing serious long-term injuries, and even mutilations. There have also been many unexplained deaths and people who were wrongly labelled as insurgents. Not one Australian official has been held to account for handing over men, women and children to torture in the war on terror. There have only been a few lower level military scapegoats. One of the main reasons why this is allowed to occur is because of the political and military enmeshment. Disturbingly, that increased due to the war on terror, and that's been one of the cornerstones and the ways that this has been able to occur. There is an increased US military presence in Australia. There is the sharing of intelligence information between the two countries and an inevitable crossover between interrogation techniques used. So there is some evidence that's come to light that JSOC, the organisation I spoke about earlier, is training Australian personnel and their counterparts, which are reportedly called 4 Squadron. 4 Squadron were reportedly created in 2005 in a joint military and intelligence role. Obtaining any information about 4 Squadron and JSOC presence in Australia is impossible. My attempted freedom of information requests have been met with a GLOMAR response. For those of you who don't know, that means that the government says they can't confirm or deny the existence of documents. I took the case to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, but was unsuccessful after the Australian government submitted secret evidence that I could not rebut, and inevitably the National Security Clause took precedence. Why is this important to know? JSOC's involvement in torturing people to death is well documented. JSOC not only operated in black sites, but also in legitimate facilities such as Camp Nama in Iraq and Guantanamo Bay, where 3 men reportedly died after being dry-boarded by JSOC members. The 3 men who died were found with their hands and feet bound, hanging from their cells in Guantanamo. The official government line was that they simultaneously suicided in their cells, even though that there were rags shoved down their throats and their hands and feet were tied. If Australian SAS forces of 4 Squadron are training and deploying with JSOC, it is definitely something the Australian people should feel concerned about. And they have the right to know what's going on. This ties in with the increased use of private military and security contractors, which has seen enormous growth as a part of the war on terror. The Australian government uses these contractors, such as the UK mega company G4S, which is made up of former UK SAS forces, to guard AFP compounds and take care of DFAT personnel. These contractors mean that governments can get around any potentially embarrassing situations. There aren't any military funerals when contractors die in these countries. The major problem that is faced now is the lack of oversight and therefore accountability. Most operate in complete secrecy with impunity. There are legal loopholes that provide criminal immunity. In 2014, Australia's national security legislation saw ASIO and their affiliates become immune from prosecution. Then you've got the training and funding of counter-terror organisations in countries that are known for torture. Basically, there's a rise in outsourcing torture now, and a lot of it has been pushed underground. Last year, the US gave $120 million worth of funding and assistance to Kenya for counter-terrorism operations. In Nigeria, they gave $40 million. The Trans-Saharan Counter-Terrorism Partnership saw the US give between 90 and 160 million. So there's a ripple effect that's happening now. So it's not over. It's not over. Then you have Australian forces training Indonesian counter-terrorism forces, and we saw what happened in West Papua. So I'm going to hand over now to Brian to talk about backfire, and then, I'll talk a little bit about Abu Ghraib after that. Over to you, Brian. All right, I've got another quote for you. The point is, there's children who no longer have mothers and fathers because they've been killed. If someone's feelings are going to be hurt for a short period of time in order to get that information, then personally, I think you've got justification. This is a quote from George OKane, who was an Australian Army major stationed at Camp Victory in Baghdad. OKane was an embedded legal officer within the US military. Many people are unaware of Australia's role in Abu Ghraib, especially the role of OKane in protecting the US military from scrutiny, as well as Howard government ministers who went on to protect him from testifying before any investigations. Whilst in Iraq, OKane was tasked with providing legal advice in relation to interrogation techniques after a prisoner died whilst in the care of the 205th Military Intelligence Brigade. These techniques included sleep management, dietary manipulation and sensory deprivation. OKane's advice to the US was that they substantially complied with the Geneva Conventions. However, he failed to provide limitations or adequate detail. Sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation are generally regarded as breaching the Geneva Conventions, by the way. After providing this advice, prisoners were kept chained in uncomfortable positions, put in hot or cold cells. To prevent prisoners from sleeping, guards would kick their cell doors, play loud music, scream at them, strip them naked, leave lights on for 24 hours a day, or some were left in total darkness for weeks at a time. OKane was also tasked at responding to the ICRC when allegations of torture arose. Instead of interviewing the prisoners and undertaking a thorough investigation, OKane went straight to US officials to seek their assistance in drafting a response. The response to the ICRC presented a glossed over version of events. OKane also developed a personal relationship with a civilian interrogation contractor who was deeply involved in the ill treatment of prisoners, therefore raising questions about his ability to remain impartial when investigating torture. OKane was also involved in hiding prisoners from the ICRC. The ICRC were described by OKane as a necessary evil and an inconvenience in subsequent interviews. In 2003, OKane became aware that the US military was hiding a man that they dubbed Detainee XXX and reported it to his US superior and an Australian colonel, and Peter Cosgrove also knew about this. But he didn't report it because he was concerned about potential breaches to international law, because you're not allowed to hide prisoners from the ICRC. He feared that if this became public, it would embarrass the US government. Despite Australian officials being made aware of this, they did not raise it as an issue with the US government. So what happened to OKane? OKane has never faced an independent investigation. Although an Australian military investigation was ordered, it was marred with incompetence, as Brian just described. The interviewers joked with OKane, and there were many errors in the final report. They were not tasked with making findings or recommendations, thereby ensuring that it would not result in any significant outcome. OKane was shielded before testifying before an Australian Senate committee and a US investigation, one of the many, led by US Major General Fay. The Australian government provided written responses, but they were provided too late for them to be included in the report. What is clear is that Howard government ministers were made aware of the allegations of torture that were occurring at Abu Ghraib, but they relied on OKane's report that said there was no evidence of abuse. There is evidence that many Australian military personnel were raising concerns about what was going on, but they were ignored. To make matters worse, OKane was promoted and is now vetting freedom of information requests relating to torture. He was the officer responsible for denying my FOI request into 4 Squadron and JSOC presence in Australia. Like Cosgrove, OKane was rewarded for his involvement in protecting the US government from embarrassment and being held to account for crimes against humanity. Whilst members of the Australian government told the public that they had no idea of the torture that was occurring, there is a vast amount of evidence that points to them not only being fully aware, but actively covering it up. One email within DFAT that was released under Freedom of Information notes that Downer had publicly stated that DFAT would be willing to investigate any allegations of torture carried out by US-led forces. And this is what the DFAT email said: "We will have to get around this somehow." This lack of documentation, destruction of evidence, an FOI system created to protect government secrets all contributes to the apparatus that's been set up to cover up what's actually going on. Now, do we want to take questions now?
No,
or
well,
should
after
I?
you finish, and then
Okay.
then we're going to collect sort of $30
All
from
right.
every member of the audience. And then
Well, just to finish, I just wanted to give a brief overview of where we're at now. So just as a global perspective here, so under the Bush administration, there were more people who were anti-torture than there is now. So we've had a dramatic increase in pro-torture rhetoric. So the main spike came after the election of President Obama. So things have gotten worse since 2009 when Obama was elected. So now in the US, for example, 60% of people think that torture is acceptable. The groundwork for what will occur under Trump has basically been laid down since Bush and continued under Obama. So this is nothing new, it's just that most of it has been further conducted in secret. For example, Obama allowed a loophole for rendition to occur on a short-term transitory basis. Not many people know that. And methods amounting to torture are still allowed under the Army Field Manual. And of course, you know Guantanamo wasn't closed. Most importantly, no one was held to account for any of the torture that occurred under the Bush administration. We've got the lower level scapegoats, but none of the officials. If anything, the torturers and those who created the torture program were rewarded for their activities. The language is also important to realise. So rather than war on terror, the Trump administration is now using the war against radical Islamism, basically. So there's a switch in language, but it's the same thing, pretty much. I believe that the situation was more dangerous under Obama, and the reason why I think that is that a lot of human rights organisations and a lot of activists dropped the ball, basically, and a lot of things that people thought were then outlawed have actually just been put into more secret practices. So the major problem with Trump at the moment is his rhetoric and creating the us and them pro-torture community. But the good news is, if there is good news, is there's more scrutiny on him. That level of scrutiny probably wouldn't have been as high if it was a Clinton administration. So that's all I want to say formally, but please feel free to ask questions.